What's going on, guys? Welcome to another video. In today's video, we're gonna be playing around with the Civic by changing the suspension. So I just went ahead and installed all new suspension on this car. So full new bushing kits, front and rear, coilovers front and back, adjustable camber arms, and this thing is good to go for the racetrack. Almost. So I need an alignment, but I wanna do a little bit of work before I bring it to an alignment shop to ensure that everything is good to go. As you guys can tell, this is going to be a lot easier using a hoist. However, this can be done with jacks and jack stands. The hoist just makes things easier so I can get the proper camera angles for you guys. However, let's get started with the front suspension. So to begin with adjusting your suspension, you're first going to start off with adjusting some parameters on the coilover. So to commence this process, let's ensure that the coilover preload is set where it needs to be. Now, typically this is set up properly from the manufacturer, but I've seen it where the spring preload is not set up that way from multiple companies. So to double check this spec, you're going to want to back off the tension on the lower of these two upper collars. This is also called the preload locking collar. To get that done, you're going to start off with the smaller of the two coilover wrenches. You're going to grab the lower collar and you're going to rotate it this way. So now that this is loose, we can adjust the preload using this collar. To remove the preload, you're going to grab your large wrench and you're going to rotate this as much as you can, because right now the spring you can see is still tight in there. By rotating this collar, you can see it becomes easier and easier to the point where this will now move. Now obviously you don't want to drive the car when it has this kind of spring preload where there's nothing. So you're gonna get a clunk anytime you go over a bump because this lower collar is gonna basically hit this spring every time you hit a bump. To ensure that we have the preload set correctly, put the spring up. We're gonna rotate this until you can no longer move the spring up and down. You're gonna then bring this collar, spin it all the way up so it's touching the upper collar. You're gonna hold the shock body and you're gonna spin the upper collar enough so that you can fit one of these coilover wrenches in between these two collars. So as you can tell here, you can now fit this in between these two. Now that is about 5 millimeters of preload. You're gonna then rotate this lower collar up to the top one and then lock this in place. So hold the top collar and then rotate the lower one. Now this will ensure that the spring not only doesn't move around, but there's no play, there's no vibrations from your setup. And if you'd like to, given that these two were locked into place, you can rotate the spring so that you have the text here facing outwards. The preload that I just showed you here can be set like this on any kind of spring that is linear. So you can see this here, this little number there is 8. This is an 8 kilo spring. So that means that it doesn't matter how much you compress this, it requires 8 kilograms of force to compress this spring 1 millimeter. Now, if you compress this 10 millimeters, that means it will require 80 kilos of force to compress that. So the more that you compress this and the more preload you put on here, it doesn't affect the way this spring behaves, except for the fact that it will change how much overall travel you have. So you don't want to overdo it with the preload. So once you have it set up like this, the preload is set. Next up, it's time to change and adjust probably the most important coilover setting out there. The main reason why people get coilovers is to change the ride height. To adjust that, we're gonna be playing around with this collar here and the shock body. We can only make that kind of adjustment on a strut like this that has the spring and shock body built into one. So to get that done, we're gonna rotate this lower collar here to the right, like that, until it's free. Now to adjust the ride height, we're gonna move the shock body either down or up, depending if we want to lower the vehicle or raise the vehicle. So if you wanna, let's say, lower your car, you'll grab this top collar here and spin this to the left. If you want to raise it, you'll do the opposite by spinning the entire coilover setup to the right. However, once you have the ride height set the way you want, you'll then lower this collar here down, lock it in place with the coilover wrench, and then you're gonna grab a tape measure, bring it all the way up to the bottom side of the top hat, and then you're gonna pick any arbitrary point on the coilover, and you're going to see what this distance here, let's say, is on this coilover versus the same thing on the opposite side. You want to ensure that both of them are identical so that the suspension feels proper once you're on the road. Following that, you can reinstall the wheels and put the car down onto the ground to see if this is the ride height that you want. If you want to do any further adjustments to either raise or lower the vehicle, you'll want to do this by raising the car back up in the air and adjusting the coilover just how I showed you. If you have the coilover set to the proper height, you'll grab the smaller of the two coilovers, tighten this collar here, and turn it to the left, which will lock the shock body in place up to the lower cup. That will ensure the entire coilover doesn't adjust while you're driving. Moving on to the rear suspension, as you can tell, this is a very different design than the front. So this here is what's called a divorce setup, where you have the spring and shock absorber as two different units. So we're going to adjust this in a slightly different fashion than the front. So we're going to start off with adjusting the spring. In order to do that, we need to make sure that the shock absorber plays no bearing on this adjustment. So to get that done, we need to remove this lower bolt down here for the shock absorber. With that bolt removed and the shock body no longer preventing the trailing arm from sagging, we can now make adjustments to the spring. We're going to need the smaller two coilover wrenches that look like this. These are both the same size. We're gonna grab one wrench and put it on the top collar and grab the other one and put it on the bottom side. What we're gonna do is we're gonna try and crack this top collar free from the bottom. So now that you can spin this freely, we can adjust this lower collar in relation to this, which will allow this total distance here to either grow or shrink, and that's gonna either lower or raise the car. So if I wanted to lower the vehicle, I'll rotate this collar to the right. So if I want to do the opposite and rotate this entire collar here to the left, that will raise the vehicle. So let's say that there is our overall setting we want. We think that's a good ride height setting. We're gonna bring this collar down here, rotate it like so, and you're gonna tighten the top collar and butt it up to the bottom one. You're gonna wanna make sure that that setting there is tight. But for our arbitrarily first test fit and our first run to adjust our ride height, let's say that will do. Next up comes adjusting the damper. So to do that, we're gonna move back to the other coilover wrenches that are the chrome ones, and you're gonna rotate this top collar here to the right until this is completely backed off and we have a little bit of room to work with. You'll then rotate the shock body in relation to this lower cup so that the bolt hole down here lines up with the lower control arm, and we can put our bolt back through that hole. So when we rotate the entire assembly to the left, you can see that it's doing the opposite of what we need. So instead, we need to rotate the entire shock body to the right, and you can see that the hole will eventually get closer and closer, and you just keep rotating this until the bolt hole lines up. Just like that. You can then run the bolt back through the hole, and then we'll torque that to spec. Now, something that I want to briefly mention, because of what's called a motion ratio, if you adjust this collar in here, which is halfway through the control arm, if you adjust this, let's say an inch, you raise it or lower it, the distance out here at the end of the control arm is going to raise or lower more than that distance. So if you, let's say, adjust this an inch, it might be 2 inches out here. So just understand the fact that when you change the ride height here, it's not the same distance that you're measuring at the fender. Just something to keep in mind. So at this point, with the shock absorber set up the way it is, there is no spring preload. So the preload now can be set on the shock absorber for a divorce setup like this. Now, it's important to know your total spring length before you set your preload. So on these BCs, you can see that this middle number right here is 160. So that is the total distance from the top of the spring to the bottom side of the spring. So to set this preload to about 5 millimeters, what we need to do is make that distance 160 from here to here. We need to shrink that down so it's about 155. You can use a regular ruler or measuring tape to get this done. So as we saw earlier, when you rotate the entire shock body to the left, this makes this total distance from here to here smaller. So we're looking for about 155 millimeters for this spring. And that there is about 155. So this now means that our spring will not be able to move at all once the suspension compresses, and it won't fly out under pressure. So when the vehicle is driving and it jounces, everything in here is going to be safe. To complete this and make sure that nothing moves, rotate this collar here, grab your wrench and rotate the entire thing to the left to ensure that it's locked into place. And then the ride height and preload is all set in the back. Now, you can eyeball it, especially in the rear when you have a divorce setup like this. However, it takes 2 seconds to make sure that the preload is set correctly. So once you have this done for one side, you're gonna replicate the same thing for the other side. You can mount the wheels back on the car and see if the ride height is what you were looking for, and this here is perfect. Low enough to get rid of a bunch of wheel gap, but not too low so the car is still completely functional. If you want to make any other adjustments to your ride height and preload, you'll want to do that now before we move on to the alignment angles. Another setting on the coilovers that is very important, especially when it comes to the drivability and the feel for the car, is the dampening. The dampening is set typically on the top of each coilover. So these BC coilovers are 32-way adjustable. So that means that there are 32 different clicks on the shock body that determine how fast the shock goes up and down. The dampening will change front to back, and you can also drive with an uneven dampening setting front to back. However, I like to make it so that the passenger and driver sides of the car have the same dampening. So on the front side of the car, the dampening adjustment is found behind that little cover. And you can see that there's that little knob right there that says BC on it. What I usually do is I will set that to the middle setting. So in this case, because these are 32-way adjustable, I'll set this to 16. I'll set that to 16 on the passenger side and the driver side, and the same thing front to back. Once I drive the car, that's when I will change the dampening setting and go from there. So you can make it stiffer by rotating this knob here clockwise. If you want to make it softer, you'll rotate it counterclockwise. It's kind of hard to get to, but you can rotate this and set it to whatever setting you want. The same concept applies to the rear of the car. However, for this, the dampening adjustment is found behind the carpet. So if you guys did the install for the coilovers, you guys know exactly where it is. You guys can also buy extenders so that you don't need to pull back the carpet every time you want to adjust your dampening. During the initial setup, when you're installing your coilovers and dialing this in, you might want to access it a couple times, but once you have it set up, you typically won't adjust the dampening for pretty much the entire lifetime of the car, unless you're tracking. If your ride height is going to be very low, and let's say your car is rubbing, you'll turn the dampening up so that you're essentially making the car stiffer. It's not going to be good for the coilovers, but that's going to be a way around to get you by until you can raise the vehicle and then turn the dampening down. This next part is important because you need to ensure that your tires are kind of facing in the proper orientation. They don't need to be bang on, but ensuring that they're pretty close to where they need to be ensures that when you bring your car to the alignment shop, you're not going to be absolutely destroying these tires and prematurely wearing them. The stickier of a tire compound you have and the more out of spec your alignment is, the faster you'll chew through these tires. So if you guys can't get an alignment for a week or two, I would not suggest driving your car in the meantime. If you need to drive, maybe 20, 30 miles at most, that's kind of pushing it, but more than that, I wouldn't drive the car. With your aftermarket suspension now in, the first of many specs that we're going to try and adjust is the caster. The caster angle is the angle in which the strut goes through versus straight up and down versus a vertical axis. So you can see that this right here is tilted back a little bit at the top, which means a couple things. The more caster you have, the more camber your car will inherit as you turn. This is a really important spec when you're talking about tracking your car and trying to maximize the front grip as you try and make the car rotate around a turn. Now, if your car does not have rear wheel steering, which most cars don't, you'll only have some sort of caster adjustment for the front. When it comes to actually trying to dial in your caster, you'll try and get as much as possible. However, it's not really an adjustment that you can change. Even with the adjustable top hats in there that allow us to adjust the camber, there's not really any kind of adjustment here for the caster. The roll center correction kit that I have installed right here from Aerogenics, that's placed between the lower control arm and the ball joint, you can purchase a different one that will give you more caster. However, I'm going to try this setup here out, and if I want more caster, I can replace this spacer with a different one. So as it stands, there's not really any kind of adjustment for the caster on this vehicle. The next two parameters that we're going to be adjusting now have to do with the wheel and the tire. So we're going to talk now about camber. Camber is essentially how much the wheel is tilted in or out in relation to the car. So when it's tilted in, that's cambered in, which is negative. If it's out, that is positive camber. Now, every single car on the road that I know of has camber in. And the reason for that is so that you actually lean on the tire as the car rolls and you get better grip. So you don't really want it straight up and down, you'll want it slightly cambered. And the harder you push your car, theoretically, the more camber you want. So there's a couple different ways to adjust that on the car. The first of which is going to be found on the top hat. So considering we have aftermarket suspension with camber adjustment found in there, you can actually tilt in the strut and push it in, which will camber the wheel in. Another way to adjust the camber is going to be found in the wheel well. So you can see right here on this suspension design how there's one top bolt and a lower bolt. And these two bolts connect the strut up to the knuckle. So if you want to change the camber in here, what you can actually do is replace this upper bolt and or this lower bolt to a different kind. So from this company here, SPC, they make this part number, and this is an aftermarket bolt. So once you crack this open, you can see that this is not a standard bolt. So this little profile right here is a cam, kind of like a camshaft in your car. And the way that this installs is pretty easy. So to get started, you'll want to loosen up both of these bolts. And that there will technically allow us to have a tiny bit of movement in here. So if that there isn't enough range to actually dial in your camber, what you can do is you'll take out this top bolt completely, and then you'll install this entire unit. So you'll thread it in from the same direction, and you'll ensure that this little tab is on the inside of the shock body. So once you put it in there like that, you'll then throw the washer that's included along with the nut. You'll snug it up, and depending on which direction you turn this side of the bolt head, it'll give you more or less camber. Now what's cool too is that if you also replace the lower bolt with this same thing and do the opposite of this bolt, if you push this in and this out, you'll get even more camber. The same thing goes with the opposite if you're trying to look for positive camber. So I don't think that I need to install this bolt. However, if you guys do want to install it, you definitely can. I think that I'm gonna have enough camber adjustment with the top hat itself. If I need more, I'll install this guy. Now, if you have a close look at the instructions, you can see that it tells you what torque spec to torque this to, and that's 125 foot-pounds. Once you go through with that, these camber bolts will be installed. When it comes to setting up the camber for the rear of the car, it's a little bit different than the front. So the same concept applies where you're trying to tuck in or straighten up the wheel to get the alignment where you need to. Now, when you have a factory arm that looks like this, where you have literally no camber adjustments whatsoever with this, you're kind of stuck, which is why I changed out the factory arm for an upgraded adjustable one. So this here is the arm, and you can see that we have an adjustable section right here. So what we're going to be doing is basically loosening up the jam nuts from the center portion of the adjustment, and by turning this either clockwise or counterclockwise, what we're going to be doing is making this entire distance from here to where it mounts up to the car either shorter or longer. The longer you make this, the more the wheel and the hub is going to camber out. The smaller you make it, the more it's going to camber in. So I made an adjustment on the driver's side component. I'm going to replicate the same thing for this side and then lock it in place. One more tip is that if you guys have control arms that have spherical ends to them, before you lock up the jam nut on the actual arm, you'll want to straighten this joint up so that it can articulate and it can move as it's supposed to. When you bring this to the mechanic shop, make sure that they do the same thing. As far as actually adjusting the camber, you can measure your camber a couple ways. You can grab a gauge like this, and I'll link one of these in the description box, or if you don't have one of these or don't want to purchase one, so if you go on the Measure app on your phone, there's a tab on the bottom for level, and you can see the angle. So if you put this up to the hub or your wheel, you can see how much camber you have. And right now you can see that it says I have about 2 degrees of camber. That is with the suspension unloaded. So once you put the wheel back on the car and put the car down on the ground, the car is going to camber in, and that's going to give you your proper camber reading. I'm going to be aiming for about -2 to -3 degrees of camber up front, and the same thing in the back. And that is functional camber, given I'm going to be tracking this car. The last and most important part of the alignment is going to be setting your toe. So the toe is essentially how much your wheel is towed in versus out with the steering wheel pointed straight. So you're gonna kind of set this up differently depending if you have a front wheel drive, rear wheel drive, or even all wheel drive car, along with what kind of alignment you're going for, whether if you're going for a street versus track alignment setup. So the more toe you have, either out or in, the faster your tires are going to wear. So ideally on a normal car, you want them pretty much dead straight, not quite, but just slightly off. And having them off like this when you're driving to the alignment shop is very bad because you're gonna destroy your tires in no time. So for this kind of setup, we're gonna try and set this up so that it's pointing straight, at least to get us to the alignment shop so we're not destroying these rubbers. The easiest way to determine if your toe is out of spec is your steering wheel will most likely not be pointing straight when you're driving straight down the road. To make changes to your toe setting on the front of your car, you're gonna wanna adjust the front tie rod section. So to do that, what you'll do is you'll back off this little nut right here that's attached to the inner tie rod, and you're gonna spin the inner portion of the tie rod to make the distance from the inner to the outer tie rod end larger or smaller. Given that this adjustment is found behind the steering axis, the larger you make that distance, the more toe in you will get. The opposite happens when you make that smaller, so you'll get toe out. So for the suspension in the Civic, we have this bulky lower control arm that connects back here at the center of the car, goes out towards the hub, and then forwards towards the body. Now to adjust the toe on this kind of setup, the adjustment is going to be found at the front of the trailing arm. So when you loosen up the 1 and 2 bolts found on the front section of the trailing arm, and then you move the arm inwards versus outwards, you're gonna be changing your toe. So when you push it in, you get toe in. When you push it out, you get toe out. My advice to you guys is after installing the coilovers and your aftermarket control arms on your car, what I would do at that point is then put the car on the ground and only drive it to the alignment shop whenever you're ready to bring it there. If the alignment seems okay and the arms aren't completely out of spec, you're safe to drive it to the alignment shop. If they're that bad, only at that point should you change it. If you position yourself just outside of the track of the front wheels and you look down the car, you will visually be able to tell if your toe is in or out a considerable amount, and the same thing goes for your camber. If it is very bad, very severe, that's when I would do these adjustments. Short from that, the only things that you'll really need to do are install the coilovers, set the coilovers to the correct ride height and everything, and then change any spherical end for your control arms so that the ends are facing straight up and down. If you guys do end up taking your car to the track, the best way to find out how your alignment is by measuring the temperature of your tires. If you pick up one of these relatively inexpensive infrared thermometers and you point it at the inside, middle, and outside of the tire, you'll get a good idea as to seeing how your alignment is. If the inside of the tire is hotter than the outside, that means that you have an improper alignment. It either means that you either need to add or remove a little bit of camber, depending on how your track and tire pressure is set up. But your tires will tell you everything. Considering I still have a bunch of aftermarket parts to install on this car, this thing is not going to be leaving the garage yet. So with that being said, the alignment will still need to be taken care of at some later point, but for now, we're going to leave it as is. Now, if you guys have one vehicle that needs an alignment, I wouldn't invest the money into a DIY alignment kit. If you guys are looking to change your alignment multiple times, or if you have multiple vehicles, that is where I think it makes sense, because you can invest hundreds, if not thousands of dollars into a DIY alignment setup. So if you guys want to find any links to the tools or products that I used in this video, you guys can find that in the description box. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. We're going to be addressing the front end of the Civic with aftermarket parts and brakes. I'll see you soon.